Well, hello there, dear friends. Welcome to video 5 of my new series, Stories That Unite in Dark Times. Just wanted to start off with a quick thank you to all my newsletter subscribers who've been very, very talkative in the comment section to these videos. Thank you so much, especially to my Patreon supporters who have been here with me as I record these videos live and who've been especially helpful with their comments. Some, not all of which have been complimentary, some of which have been quite challenging, some of which have been actually all of which have been extremely interesting. I'm very grateful to all of you for challenging me and for making sure that my thought process isn't entirely a cold bowl of oatmeal, but actually makes a little bit of sense. You've really challenged me. You've really helped me prepare and think about these videos. And you've also helped, I do get nervous sometimes when I stare at the one lidless eye of this video camera. Yes, very much like Sauron. But your interaction with me, your continuing conversation with me just makes it clear that this really is just a conversation. And there's no reason for me to get all uppity about it. Very quick recap of what we've said so far in this video. I won't get too deep on it because there's already been 4 videos. They're quite detailed in their content. But if you haven't watched them, you really should, especially video 1, where I introduce my premise, the premise that right now, in this particular historical and cultural moment that we are existing in year 2 of COVID, we no longer have the clarity or the simplicity that we had at the very beginning, when we could all unify behind a single story, a story of the need for courage in the face of great odds. And with that story, there were some very simple things we could do, not easy again, but simple things we could do to work on ourselves and also to help others to be able to get through the initial difficulties of lockdown periods and the fear that we all had when we knew so little about this pandemic. Now we know much more, and yet the confusion seems to have gotten worse. And I've argued, following Paul Kingsnorth, that at least partially this is a result of now there no longer being a single story unifying everyone, but there now being several stories that people are gravitating towards. And these stories at their heart are not unifying. They are at heart disuniting and are only making our fragmented culture and society even more fragmented. So what are we to do? This has been the point of this series of videos. I'm really following people like Paul Kingsnorth, people like Wendell Berry, who make the argument that great sweeping change, although appealing, especially to us Americans, who like the glitz and glamour of revolution, real change has to start from the small actions of individual people, and what better people to start with than ourselves. And I argue that a way of doing that, or at least a way of beginning that, or a way of finding strength to do that, is to become more rooted through the choice of stories that we allow into our hearts, specifically into our hearts, because stories have, as I've argued repeatedly, the real power to make our hearts whole. But they also have a real power to make our hearts divided and to divide us from other people. So it's not really enough to simply be rooted in good story. It's also important for us to be able to get out of that state of internal wholeness and then share it with others. So there really have been 2 themes to this video series. One is, how do you become rooted in yourself? How do you find those kinds of roots that help you become a wholehearted person? But then in the process of doing that, perhaps it's a long process that you will not be able to accomplish. I certainly will not in any short period of time. Still, is it possible? Yes. To begin our movement outwards, to start working on connection, start working on community, to start working on allowing that rootedness that's beginning within ourselves to start rooting out to other people. I've used the metaphor of the mushroom repeatedly. If you don't understand how it fits, if you haven't heard me talk about it before, watch video 2. That's the one where we really break down why we should all be more like mushrooms. But let's get into this video because it's an exciting one. I thought we would finish with this one. I thought this would be a 5-video series, but now I'm fairly sure it'll take 6, if not more. Hopefully that's exciting news for you. It's certainly exciting for me. I'm enjoying being here. I'm enjoying inhabiting this head and heart space for a while. Now, before we move on from our discussion of unifying stories to something a little higher and a little more challenging, we have to face a certain reality. And it can be a bit of an annoying reality, but it's still reality, so we have to deal with it. Some people simply don't accept the vision of story that I have been sharing with you in these videos. And usually, the people who don't accept it fall into different categories. The first category I want to talk about is those who are opposed down to their rooted heart to the very idea of reading classics because they're difficult, because they've come across them before, because they have encountered them, or maybe they've only heard about them. They've tried to read them. Those classics haven't grabbed their heart. They've been too difficult to get into, and so they dropped them. Or one person in particular echoed my own high school teenage self when she complained, why should I read the Iliad if it's just about a bunch of angry men going into battle with swords bared? I certainly would agree with that assessment when I was 18, or maybe a little younger, when I was in high school. And there are several ways of answering this. And in no way do I want to put down these objections as somehow being silly or not having any place. They are absolutely valid. And I want to talk about them in several ways. First of all, I want to return back to Italo Calvino's wonderful New York Review of Books essay, Why We Should Read the Classics, and quote something that I didn't have a chance to quote in my last video. Here's what he says. The ninth reason why we should read the classics is this. The classics are books that we find all the more new, fresh, and unexpected upon reading, the more we thought we knew them from hearing them talked about. So, in other words, we might have heard all kinds of things about them, how they're good, how they're challenging, how you must read them, how you should never read them. But once we encounter them, the actual effect on us is deeper, is more surprising than what we heard about them. Naturally, this only happens, he continues, when a classic really works as such. That is, when it establishes a personal rapport with the individual reader. If the spark doesn't come, that's a pity. But we do not read the classics out of duty or respect, but only out of love. Except at school. And school should enable you to know, either well or badly, a certain number of classics among which, or in reference to which, you can then choose your classics. School is obliged to give you the instruments needed to make a choice, but the choices that count are those that occur outside and after school. So this is a really important point. Your list of classics will be different from mine. That's almost absolutely sure. But there's one thing that perhaps you noticed or perhaps you didn't that he mentioned in this quote. The only way that you can have your own list of classics that really speak to your heart and that you enjoy and that are yours is if you already have had the difficult training of being schooled in them. And this, unfortunately, is something that many of us have not had. Our education system has failed us in this. I've been very lucky. I've been forced to read many of the classics in school. And so I can have a rather extensive personal list of classics that I love and that I will return to multiple times. And every reading is fresher and more illuminating than the previous one. But if you haven't had it, then there's something to be said about perhaps exploring the possibility of using this year, this difficult year, to embrace a little bit of difficulty, to enter back into that arena of school, and to bite the bullet and maybe try out some of those classics that are difficult, especially if you haven't had that training in school. There is something to say, and I'm not the only one saying this. There are a lot of people that are embracing this reality right now. That if there are many things that the pandemic has revealed about us, many things. But certainly one thing it has revealed is that we're really uncomfortable with discomfort, that we really shy away from pain. And that pain doesn't necessarily have to be physical. It can be emotional. It can be mental. We don't like it. And we've been forced to deal with it, some of us in traumatic ways during the pandemic. But I think a lot of us have come to recognize that there is a level of willing embracing of uncomfortable realities that can actually produce some good things in our life that we haven't been doing before or that we haven't been doing enough. So people like Cal Newport and other people in that sort of intelligent self-help arena are really starting to write some interesting things, some deep things about the need to embrace difficulty in our everyday life in all kinds of ways. There's a wonderful book by Brad Stulberg, who wrote Peak Performance, which is a book about how to become a peak performer based on the training strategies of peak athletes. He wrote another book, The Practice of Groundedness, that is exactly about this. A book that I do recommend. I read it. I enjoyed it. It's not absolutely... He's limited by his worldview being too almost exclusively scientific. So that, for example, when he encounters enduring truths in the philosophies of the past, whether they're Eastern or Western, he's quite fair about including both. He almost uses it as a corollary to scientific truth instead of leading the other way around, which is the way I would prefer he do it. But still, the book is very good. And in it, and in other books similar to it, one of which Cal Newport is writing at the moment, or he's going to be writing. He claims that his next book project is going to be a book on the deep life, as he calls it. So this is something that a lot of people are thinking about. And nearly all of them, without really stepping on a soapbox or talking down at people from a perch, are encouraging people to embrace difficulty because they are doing it themselves. So I encourage you to do it as well, not because I've done it before and I can tell you it's worth it, but because I recognize within myself the need, the reality of constantly facing my lack of desire to be uncomfortable and recognizing that that's not a good quality in my character, and I'd like to fight it, especially since on the other side of pushing through that resistance, there is always some very interesting stuff that happens, and a lot of it is very joyful. So that's what I want to encourage you to do this year. Instead of going on a binge of all the classics and taking a list of all the great Greek and Roman classics and going through them in a single year, if you want to do that, of course, go ahead. But why don't I encourage you to do something a little bit simpler, humbler. Take one book that is generally considered by many to be important, something like the Brothers Karamazov or a Dickens novel, or maybe a work of classic philosophy, something that generally is considered important, but that you found impossible to get into. Either you've never cracked it open or you've found it difficult once you started. For me, this has always been the first few days of reading any novel of Dostoevsky or Charles Dickens. And I'll tell you especially, I was very resistant to reading the later novels of Charles Dickens, the ones that were published after David Copperfield. I've always loved David Copperfield. It's an easy read. I found it to be very frothy, but also deep, like at the same time. And, just beautiful in a lot of ways. But his later novels are generally considered to be darker. They're more complex. They're more difficult stylistically. He tries new things in them. And they are very long, 900 pages, 1,000 pages. Little Dorrit in particular is a novel that plays with different stylistic conventions in ways that most authors would tell you simply not to do as teachers. Like if you're learning from an author who knows what he or she is doing, they will tell you, don't do this. And yet Dickens did it. And it meant that about 200 or 300 pages of Little Dorrit, the first 200 or 300 pages of Little Dorrit out of 1,100 pages are extremely difficult to get into. But I forced myself the first time I read it. I think this must have been in high school. And I tell you, around page 700, there's started this glimmering of something. And as I'm reading it, I'm starting to feel this very powerful internal transformation. I can tell that Dickens is leading me to something that's going to just break my heart. And by the time all of the different threads of the novel came together in that typical Dickensian way where everything comes together and explodes, I was weeping. I was weeping as I was reading this. And I'm telling you, that kind of heart-breaking in the positive sense experience is something that I wish all of you to have. But sometimes it requires us to plow through several hundred pages of difficult material. And I hear you saying it. Who has that kind of time? Well, part of the reality of our life is that we have less time than anybody in history because we fill it so often, let's be honest, with distractions that are very easily gotten and that give us immediate hits of pleasure. I'm talking about our cell phones. I'm talking about the internet. I'm talking about email. I'm talking about streaming services. How many options do we have? How many new series we must watch right now? And how many people, instead of defaulting to something like picking up a book in a moment when they have a free time, even when it's just simply going to the bathroom, how many people just simply pull out their phone? Most of us. And it takes a lot of effort to get away from that. Something I do recommend that you consider doing. So that's the first opposition that I wanted to bring to your attention, that the classics are difficult, so why should we even start? The other opposition that I've anticipated and that some people have offered to me in my presentation of this kind of vision of storytelling is the following. These people will say, you are hanging on to old-fashioned modes of storytelling that no longer are relevant. And in particular, these people will say, you hang too much on the power and the importance of the hero's journey as a storytelling paradigm. And I do. I, like many other people, many other writers, believe that the structure of the hero's journey is something that is intrinsic to our experience as human beings in our life. So that structure narratively, the hero's journey in fairy tales, in epic poems, in literature, in movies, in modern fantasy novels, is something that I look for. And if I see it done well, I find it to be very rewarding. And a lot of other people do as well. We shouldn't overlook that. However, there has been a recent sort of pushback against it. And it comes in different forms. The first complaint is that heroes are not relatable. They are too beyond the realm of our everyday mundane reality. They are not fallible enough. They are already, even at the beginning of their journey, at a level or two above what we are here now. So this is not something that we can relate to. It's not something that's useful for us. Why should we waste time? And the answer to that, very often given by today's culture, is, okay, no problem. We'll rewrite the paradigm of the hero's journey, but we'll make the hero not heroic. We'll make him relatable. We will make him fallible. This, when done badly, can result in absolute disastrous storytelling choices. I talked a little bit about this in my podcast episode with John Hears at Why Are We Talking About Rabbits. I will include a link to that conversation in the notes to this video. I talked about it there at length. Here I will only say that Sir Gawain, who is the heroic character at the beginning of the story, is everything a hero shouldn't be. He wakes up in a brothel on Christmas morning. He is incapable of doing anything other than drink. He looks up to all the knights around him, but he is unable to overcome his own personal vices. He revels in them. He prefers them. And when he is then almost forced to go on a typical hero's journey by the very strange concatenation of circumstances that happens when the Green Knight comes to King Arthur's court, which in the movie is a very strange scene, very different from the original poem. He goes on this journey, and the journey is as one would expect. Since he's not really a hero, he messes up at every turn. He trusts the wrong people. He makes very stupid choices along the way. He leaves himself open to all kinds of dangers that he shouldn't. And in the final analysis, he runs away from his heroic choice. Then there's this very interesting long sequence in the movie where we see playing out the results or the consequences of Gawain's not being a true hero. And the movie ends with this very interesting scene where Gawain finally comes face to face with this cowardice and decides that he is going to go through with the difficulty of the beheading game. And my opinion on this story is quite negative. I don't like the movie at all. I thought it was a very beautifully shot movie with very challenging and interesting ideas. But as a story, it really doesn't work, I think. And I get into that in that podcast episode, so I won't repeat it here in too much detail. Only to say that what ends up happening is that the only real way, the only storytelling resolution to the problem of the fallible hero, the relatable hero, is to admit that no heroic transformation is really possible, and it's okay. It's better for it to be that way. So no real ideals are no real ideals of behavior are possible, because every ideal of behavior is actually a lie. This is the premise behind the entirety of Game of Thrones, something I've talked about at length in other places. So I won't talk about it here. The other complaint that people have when it comes to using the hero's journey as a kind of storytelling paradigm is that they complain that this is a male-dominated storytelling form. Now, first I will say that there are female heroes, not heroines, technically speaking, female heroes. One of the most obvious recent versions of this is the movie Wonder Woman, the first one. I haven't watched the second one, but the first one is a very clearly written out hero's journey with a woman as the main character. And technically there's nothing wrong with that. And that's really not the point. The point that these people are making is not that it's male, men or women. It's that the format itself is overwhelmingly and overweeningly masculine. And what it ends up doing is it ends up encouraging the kind of antisocial, toxic masculine behavior that you often see on the internet in the comment section of YouTube. Now, I don't really want to argue with that, because I think that's kind of beside the point. Does the hero's journey encourage such people to have to sort of become more toxic in their masculinity? Yeah, probably, but that's not really the fault of the hero's journey. That's the fault of other things, other cultural factors. Still, there is something to say about at least some versions of the hero's journey as being not perfect as a storytelling form. In particular, if you look at the hero's journey in its ancient manifestation, in its mythic manifestation, especially in the myths of Greece and the myths of Rome, oftentimes you will see the hero's journey in those versions being an example of overweening masculine assertions of power that oftentimes have collateral damage in the deaths of innocents, particularly women and children. You will see this in the myth of Hercules. Hercules is not a particularly nice hero. So that does happen. And in particular, you see this argument in books such as The Heroine's Journey by Gail Carriger, a very interesting book that I can recommend as a manual to writers who are interested in writing the heroine's journey. And I'll talk about what that is in a second. But I still think that there's too much protest around this. And I'll explain why. The heroine's journey, actually, and this is my answer to this complaint of male preference, the heroine's journey is a pleasant compliment to not all heroes' journeys, but to that version of the hero's journey that is particularly objectionable to such people. And I want to make it clear that there are different manifestations of the hero's journey, some of which are higher in terms of a hierarchy of values than others. So yes, there is a lot of value to a heroine's journey as well, because it's a complement to the more overweeningly masculine hero's journey. I'll briefly explain the differences between the two. The hero's journey is the traditional fairy tale and mythological structure for most fairy tales and myths. It goes something like this. There's a character, main character, who lives in a comfortable home, in a village, in a place that envelops him with its comfort. It's a good place that he lives in. He receives a call to adventure, usually from a mentor figure. He resists that call to adventure initially, but because of external circumstances or because of an internal transformation, depending on the story, he then accepts the call to adventure and goes out into the wilderness, mediated by this mentor figure who accompanies him on part of the journey, but eventually has to leave him. Then when he goes out on adventure, he has a series of try-fail sequences, or a series of trials, or a series of adventures. And each one of those adventures is set up as a goal that needs to be overcome, an antagonist that comes in the way of the goal, and the disaster or the failure of the hero that leads him on to the next challenge. And through a series of challenges, he gets further and further and deeper into a state of utter and absolute failure and disaster, at which point he has to encounter the darkness of the reality of his utter failure in something called the dark night of the soul, And oftentimes what happens here is that he either sacrifices himself or does something that results in the unexpected help of a wild or spiritual power that gives him aid in overcoming the ultimate villain, bad guy, and that also aids him in overcoming his internal resistance to transformation. So there's a dual level going on here of overcoming and of transformation, at which point the hero then has to return home. He is transformed, and his return home also begins the transformation of the home to something that is new. And oftentimes what happens upon his return home is that there is a revelation that home is not as good as he thought it was at the beginning, and that just as he needed that transformation, his home needs it also. And depending on how violent or how overweeningly masculine the story is, this restoration of home can take a more violent or a more peaceful turn of events. For example, in the Odyssey, it's very violent. Odysseus has to come and destroy all of the suitors. In the Lord of the Rings, it's less violent. It's more about cleaning out a rot that came out, but that was at the heart of Hobbiton from the very beginning, and is crowned by the beautiful image of the tree growing at the center of Hobbiton. A much more pleasant image. Now, the heroine's journey also has similar beats, but it's different. If the hero's journey is about leaving the confines, or rather leaving the beautiful pleasantness of family willingly, the heroine's journey is about losing family unwillingly. The heroine usually has some sort of disaster happen to her that necessitates her either losing or leaving all of her family. She then gives herself over to intense mourning. That mourning usually involves some form of disguise or external transformation. Through the process then of leaving a bit, or of being forced out of the confines of family, she then does everything in her power to gather to herself a new family, a kind of found family. So as opposed to the hero who goes out into the wilderness by himself and eschews the help of others, because this is all about him overcoming his internal demons as well as the dragons outside, she comes to recognize the value and the need of familial relationships. There is also a descent, just as there is in the hero's journey, usually into the underworld in the heroine's journey. Then there is an encounter with the source of the problem in the underworld. And the way that the heroine overcomes that is not by having an intense battle alone with the antagonist, but rather it's the new family that helps her overcome the darkness at the underworld. And then she ascends from the underworld back into the world above. But rather than come back home and restore the fallen home to a higher state, oftentimes a heroine's journey ends with compromise. It ends with a kind of ambiguous or ambivalent resolution that is nevertheless oftentimes a positive one. So you can see the difference between the two. Oftentimes romantic comedies fall into the heroine's journey, and Gail Carriger actually makes the argument that Harry Potter is a heroine's journey, although I would argue that it has elements of both. Okay, why are we talking about this? Some prefer intrinsically, especially in modern literature and modern streaming, they prefer the lone heroics of the hero's journey. Others prefer the found family of the heroines. In either case, this tends once again to disunite people. But what if you could have both? Well, in fact, you can. There's a wonderful example of this. It's The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. It's a fantastic short fairy tale fantasy that was written in the middle part of the 20th century. This story is an absolutely fantastic example of two heroic structures happening at the same time. There is the heroine's journey of the last unicorn, who was called Lady Amalthea at some point. And then there is the rather humorous initially, but eventually extremely poignant hero's journey of Prince Lear. And those two intertwine with each other at key moments of the novel in very fantastic ways. ending in one of the most beautiful moments I've ever seen in modern fiction, where the resolution, the transformation of home, that is the resolution of the hero's journey, and the ambivalent compromise that is at the heart of the resolution of the heroine's journey come together in an intense moment of beauty. I'm not going to get into it because I want you to read the book. That this moment left me absolutely speechless, and I would even dare say that it rivaled in some sense some of those experiences of reading the classics that I had in high school and after. So yes, you can actually have the similar experiences of transformation, of our heart becoming whole through the experience of story when you read modern literature. It is possible. It's just much more difficult to find it. But there's an even higher example of this intertwining of the two kinds of journeys into a unified whole. It's tied to the idea lying just beyond everything that we've been saying during this whole series. And it might be a surprising idea for you. For some, it's a dangerous idea, for sure. But really, it's a transformational one. And I really look forward to sharing it with you in what I anticipate and I hope will be the last video in the series next time. Anyway, thanks again for joining me. And I will see you when we do this again next week. Bye-bye for now.